Have you ever shivered from the cold, wrapped in 3 blankets when it's -20 outside and the heating suddenly turns off? Now imagine that this is not a temporary glitch, but your reality every winter, without all the blankets, heaters, and even warm clothes that we are used to. How does it feel to wake up every day in an ice hut, knowing that frostbite is not just a horror story from the news, but a real threat to lose fingers, limbs, and even life? How did medieval peasants survive in this hell of cold when their homes were little more than a drafty straw tent? We are used to comfort, where hot water and cozy warmth are a given. But what if I told you that, despite all your smartphones and smart homes, you would be more helpless in the event of a real collapse than any downtrodden medieval peasant who knew exactly how to survive? Are you ready to learn about the shocking, sometimes disgusting but ingenious ways in which our ancestors fought the bitter cold? Get ready to dive into a world where survival depended on desperate ingenuity, dirty tricks, and amazing stamina. Watch this video until the end to understand the cost of each moment of warmth and why their life was a real feat of survival. In addition to passive methods of heating homes, peasants actively used clothing as a permanent, portable source of heat. They wore several layers of clothing made of coarse, unpainted wool, and also used processed animal skins. These materials, due to their dense but porous structure, were ideal heat insulators. Woolen tunics, cloaks, trousers, hats, and leg wraps created many layers of air between the body and the cold air. The air trapped between the layers of fabric was an excellent insulator, slowing down the loss of heat from the body. An important aspect was the multi-layer 24/7 system. Many farmers slept directly in their day clothes, adding extra skins or thick wool blankets on top. This significantly reduced the temperature difference between the body and the environment, minimizing heat loss during sleep. Children often slept together with their parents or siblings, using each other's body heat to keep them warm. Every item of clothing and every skin that came into the house counted and was used with maximum efficiency. In addition to wool and hides, bags filled with straw or hay could be used for internal insulation, which served as pillows, blankets, or even mattresses. Sometimes, in the most desperate cases, dry leaves or moss could be stuffed under the clothes for additional insulation. This portable heating system was critically important, compensating for the shortcomings in heating the home and allowing it to remain operational and avoid frostbite even in conditions of constant cold and dampness. The principle of layering was intuitively understood by the peasants and used by them everywhere. Several thin layers of clothing create more insulating air pockets than one thick layer. In addition, such a system made it possible to regulate heat exchange. Depending on the activity and ambient temperature, it was possible to remove or add a layer of clothing. This was especially important for people whose work was associated with constant exposure to the open air and physical exertion. In addition to wool and hides, farmers used plant fibers if they were available. For example, flax and hemp were common for making fabrics, although they were inferior to wool in thermal insulation properties. However, when combined with wool or as a bottom layer, they could play a role. Straw and hay, as already mentioned, were widely available and were used not only for stuffing mattresses, but also as temporary insulation for clothing. During particularly cold periods, people could stuff dry straw or hay into their clothing, creating an extra layer of insulation. This was a temporary but effective solution when other materials were unavailable. As for washing, hygiene in the Middle Ages was very different from modern hygiene. Clothing, especially outerwear and wool, was rarely, if ever, washed. The reasons were the lack of running water, a lack of soap, and the complexity of the process. Woolen clothing became very heavy when wet, took a long time to dry, and could deform. Instead of washing, the clothes were knocked out, ventilated, and cleaned with brushes or scrapers. The layer of dirt and grease that accumulated on the clothing could also perform an additional insulating function, although at the expense of comfort and hygiene. Underwear, if any, was washed more frequently, but it was still a rare occurrence. The smell, which we would have found unbearable, was common. It was part of a harsh reality in which survival was more important than comfort. Farmers who lived in harsh climates showed remarkable ingenuity in using the materials available to them to preserve heat. In addition to basic woolen pelts, they could use less obvious but equally effective resources. For example, The fur of wild animals obtained as a result of hunting, although it was less accessible than sheep's wool, but it had excellent thermal insulation properties. It could be used to sew hats, collars, linings for outerwear, as well as mittens, which were indispensable when working on the frost. Each mech produced was worth its weight in gold and was used as efficiently as possible, often passed down from generation to generation. Another interesting source of heat was bird feathers and down. Despite the difficulty of collecting them in sufficient quantities, feathers and fluff from wild birds could be used to stuff small pillows or even create primitive down jackets, bags stuffed with feathers that were worn over ordinary clothing for additional insulation. Such products were light and surprisingly warm, providing an air layer that perfectly retained heat. Although this was not a mass phenomenon, in some regions where bird hunting was developed, this method could be used. Do not forget about heather and straw bedding. Heather, moss, dry leaves, and straw, although not clothing in the literal sense, could be used as an additional layer of insulation between the body and the cold ground or wooden decking. Farmers could stuff them into bags that served not only for sleeping, but also as seats, and in some cases even wrap them around their feet over their shoes for extra warmth. This was especially true for long-term outdoor work, where direct contact with a cold surface led to a rapid loss of heat. The disposal of livestock waste was also an important aspect. In addition to the skins, other animal products could also be used. For example, animal fat rubbed into skin or clothing, especially leather, created an additional water-repellent and heat-insulating layer. Although this did not make the clothing more attractive, it significantly increased its protective properties from moisture and cold. It was a short-term solution, of course, but in terms of survival, every little thing mattered. The problem of hygiene, as already mentioned, was secondary to the need for survival. A peculiar smell from worn, rarely washed clothes was the norm. Moreover, some researchers believe that the layering of dirt and grease on woolen clothing not only did not worsen its thermal insulation properties, but to some extent even improved them, creating an additional protective barrier. This, of course, does not justify modern standards of hygiene, but it explains the logic of medieval man. Repairs and patches were an integral part of clothing care. Since new fabrics and clothing were expensive and hard to find, old clothes were carefully patched and re-sewn until they could not be used at all. Patches made of various materials, often contrasting in color and texture, were common. This not only extended the service life of the clothing, but also created a unique, recognizable style that today we would call vintage or rustic. Every scrap of cloth, whether wool, linen, or even a sack of wine, was used until it was completely worn out. In addition to individual clothing, farmers actively used common heat sources. In some regions, sleeping in a tight group was practiced, which made it possible to maximize the use of body heat for mutual heating. This method was especially common in large families or in communities where people slept in one large room. Portable heaters could also be used, such as clay pots or metal vessels filled with hot coals, which were placed under blankets or next to beds for local heating. These fixtures were easy to manufacture and provided extra warmth in the coldest conditions. Finally, it is important to note the role of bleaching and renewing clothing through natural processes. In winter, clothes could be hung out in the cold, where low temperatures helped kill some of the bacteria and reduce odors. Sunlight was also used for disinfection and ventilation. This primitive but effective method of dry cleaning was the only one available to many peasants. Despite the lack of modern hygiene products, people found ways to maintain clothing in a relatively acceptable condition based on their capabilities and priorities. Although for most peasants the earth floor remained just earth in some more affluent farms or in buildings erected at monasteries and castles, primitive forms of underground heating were used, which can be called proto-warm floors. This method was much more complex and required considerable engineering effort, as well as more materials. The bottom line was that shallow channels or tunnels were dug under the earthen floor. These channels could be connected to the main hearth or to a small separate furnace located nearby. Warm air and smoke from the fire passed through these channels, heating the ground and flat stones that blocked these channels from above. The heated stones then slowly and evenly transferred heat to the room, creating a much more comfortable and distributed heating than from a single central hearth. Sometimes hot coals could be laid in these channels, which smoldering released heat for a long time. Such a system was certainly a big step forward in terms of comfort and efficiency. It helped to evenly warm up the room, reducing cold zones and drafts. However, its construction required considerable resources, a large amount of stone, clay to form channels, as well as skilled knowledge. That is why such proto-warm floors were extremely rare among farmers and were found only in houses with higher incomes or in buildings where experienced craftsmen worked. But their very existence demonstrates the desire of people to improve their living conditions, even in the most primitive conditions. The use of proto-dim floors was a sign of higher status and wealth. It was not just a whim, but an investment in comfort and health. Even floor heating reduced the risk of colds, especially for those who spent a lot of time on the floor or slept on it. Stone slabs covering the channels served as accumulators of heat, slowly giving it away over time after the fire in the hearth died down. This made it possible to maintain a more stable temperature in the room throughout the night, which was impossible with heating only from an open hearth. Engineering solutions for such systems, although primitive, were quite complex for their time. It was necessary not only to dig out the channels, but also to provide a draft of smoke so that it was evenly distributed throughout the system and output outside, without smoky the room. This required an understanding of aerodynamics and the use of special dampers or openings. The channels could be lined with clay for better heat transfer and to prevent destruction. In addition, the choice of stones to cover the channels was important. They had to be flat enough, strong enough, and conduct heat well. Such complex systems, though rare, show the presence of engineering even in conditions of limited resources and lack of scientific knowledge. In addition to the technical aspects, it is worth noting the social and cultural context of using such systems. The presence of a proto-heated floor in the house not only improved living conditions, but also increased the prestige of the owner. This was a clear sign of affluence, indicating the ability to invest in comfort and innovation. Such houses could serve as a gathering place for the community on cold evenings, which further strengthened the social status of the owner. To a certain extent, these were prototypes of modern, smart homes, where comfort was achieved not only at the expense of wealth, but also due to well-thought-out engineering solutions. Perhaps some of these systems also had a drying function. Warm air passing under the floor could help to dry out the ground and reduce humidity in the room, which was especially important in wet climatic conditions. Reducing humidity not only made the air more pleasant, but also helped to prevent the growth of mold and mildew, which was a serious problem in medieval dwellings. This demonstrates the versatility of even the most primitive engineering solutions. In addition, proto-underfloor heating could be adapted for different types of fuel. If the main hearth used firewood, then coal, peat, or even dry manure could be used for underground channels, materials that smoldered longer and provided a more stable and long-lasting heat release. This made it possible to optimize the consumption of various types of fuel, depending on their availability and economic feasibility. This flexible use of resources emphasizes the practicality and adaptability of the peasant way of life. From a health standpoint, underfloor heating was a huge advantage. It not only prevented colds, but also contributed to the overall improvement of well-being. Cold and damp floors are a source of many diseases, especially rheumatism and arthritis, which were widespread in the Middle Ages. A warm, dry floor created a healthier living environment, which ultimately increased performance and life expectancy. This was an example of how relatively small engineering improvements could have a significant impact on the quality of life. Although most peasant homes had open hearths, more sophisticated homes, as well as the homes of well-to-do peasants or homesteads, boasted the presence of stoves. These structures, often made of stone and clay, were much more efficient and multifunctional than simple hearths, demonstrating an impressive level of engineering for their time. The stove was the real heart of the house, capable of providing not only stable heating, but also performing a whole range of other vital functions. The main advantage of the furnace was more efficient heat retention. Unlike an open fire, where most of the heat was blown into the air and dissipated, the furnace accumulated heat inside its massive structure. The stone and clay walls were heated and then slowly and evenly transferred heat to the room for many hours after the fire died down. This made it possible to significantly save fuel since it did not require constant laying of firewood. In addition to heating, the stoves were ideal for cooking. They allowed you to bake bread, which was the mainstay of the diet, stew meat and vegetables in pots, and slowly cook chowders that could languish in the heat of the oven all night. Unlike cooking on an open fire, food in the oven was prepared more evenly and burned less often. In addition, many ovens had special niches or compartments for drying grain, herbs, fruits, mushrooms, meat, and even clothing. The heat and dry air inside the furnace effectively prevented food spoilage and helped preserve supplies for the long winter. Some of the stoves were large enough to sleep inside, especially in the bitterest of frosts. This was especially valuable for the elderly or the sick, who needed constant, gentle warmth. The warm air inside the furnace, devoid of drafts, created ideal conditions for recuperation. Perhaps it was this practice that gave rise to the well-known folklore motifs about sleeping on the stove. In addition, the furnace could serve for medicinal purposes. The moist heat coming from the stove was used to warm patients, treat colds and joint pain. Hot stones from the furnace could be used to warm up the affected areas of the body. Thus, the stove was not just a household appliance, but a complete life support system that demonstrated the remarkable ingenuity of the peasants in using limited resources for maximum benefit. The construction of the furnace was a labor-intensive process, requiring special skills and a significant expenditure of materials. Stone and clay were the main building components. Stone provided strength and heat storage properties, while clay was used as a binder and to form the interior of the furnace. Often branches or straw were used as reinforcement, which were mixed with clay to give it greater strength and prevent cracking during drying and heating. The drying and first firing process of the furnace was also critical for its durability and safety. An improperly constructed furnace could smoke, keep heat poorly, or even pose a fire hazard. Fuel economy was one of the key reasons for the proliferation of furnaces. Unlike an open fire, which required a constant supply of wood, the stove allowed maximum use of thermal energy from the combustion of fuel. This was especially important in regions where firewood was also a scarce resource. The furnace's ability to store heat and slowly release it over time meant that less fuel was needed to maintain a comfortable temperature during the day and night. This significantly reduced labor costs for preparing firewood, which was a significant advantage for farmers. The social significance of the furnace is also difficult to overestimate. It was not just the center of the house, but also a gathering place for the whole family. People gathered around the stove on cold evenings, told stories, and did needlework. For the children, the stove was the warmest and safest place in the house. In some traditions, the stove was considered a sacred place, a talisman of the house and a source of vitality. This gave the furnace not only practical, but also deep cultural significance. The variety of furnace designs was considerable. Depending on the region and available materials, the furnaces could have different shapes and sizes, from simple adobe structures to massive stone ovens with multiple compartments for cooking and drying. In some cases, stoves could be integrated into a wall, creating a heating system that distributed heat across multiple rooms. This demonstrates the continuous development and improvement of technologies, even in the face of limited resources and knowledge. The oven also played an important role in preserving food. Drying grain and other products in the oven significantly extended their shelf life, which was critical for survival in winter. Grain dried in the oven was less susceptible to spoilage and rot, which ensured that food supplies were available until the next harvest. It was a kind of refrigerator and conservatory of a medieval house. Most peasant houses in medieval England were extremely compact, often consisting of a single room that served as a bedroom, kitchen, dining room, and living room at the same time. This layout was not an accidental whim, but a pragmatic engineering solution aimed at maximizing heat preservation and minimizing heat loss in harsh winters. The smaller the room, the easier and cheaper it is to heat it. One large room with a central hearth allowed the heat to be more evenly distributed throughout the entire volume. The absence of internal walls and partitions prevented the formation of cold zones and drafts, which could occur in a multi-room house with poor heating. The whole family, and sometimes several families, as well as livestock, as will be discussed later, were located in one space, which allowed the use of body heat for additional heating. As for windows, their number was reduced to an absolute minimum. Often, there was only one small window in the house and sometimes none at all. The reasons for this were purely pragmatic. Windows were the main sources of heat loss. In the Middle Ages, there was no glass available to ordinary peasants, so the windows were covered either with wooden shutters, oiled parapet, or stretched animal skins. These materials were poor insulators and could not provide reliable protection from cold and wind. Each window meant additional heat loss and also required effort to manufacture and install. The small size of the windows and their rarity were a deliberate compromise. Farmers sacrificed natural light and fresh air for the sake of heat preservation. Inside the houses, it was dark and stuffy, especially when the hearth was burning and smoke filled the room. This certainly had a negative impact on hygiene and health, contributing to the spread of eye diseases and respiratory infections. However, in an environment where the main goal was simply not to freeze to death, this was a necessary sacrifice. The darkness and bad air were the price of survival. This ascetic approach to building houses was a direct reflection of the harsh realities of medieval life, where functionality and survival dictated all architectural decisions. One of the characteristic features of medieval peasant houses was their extremely low ceilings. The ceiling height rarely exceeded 2 to 5 meters, and sometimes it could be lower. This architectural detail, which today seems uncomfortable, was actually a very practical and thoughtful engineering solution aimed at maximum heat preservation. The basic principle was that warm air rises up. In a high-ceilinged room, most of the heat from the hearth would rise to the ceiling and accumulate there, leaving the lower living area cold. Due to the low ceiling, the warm air could not rise too high and stayed closer to people, creating a more comfortable temperature at the human height level. This made it possible to use each unit of heat generated by the hearth much more efficiently and minimize energy losses. In addition, low ceilings meant less air for heating. The smaller the volume of the room, the faster and more economical it can be heated. This was critically important in conditions when fuel, firewood, peat, was a scarce and expensive resource. The low volume also contributed to a faster saturation of the air with heat from people and animals breathing. In addition to preserving heat, low ceilings had other practical advantages. They made construction easier and required less building materials: wood for beams, straw for the roof. The shorter the walls, the lower the load on the frame, and the easier it was to ensure the stability of the structure. In addition, the low ceiling allowed farmers to reach the beams on which they could hang clothes, herbs, dry food, or tools, making the most of the available space. Of course, low ceilings created their own disadvantages: a sense of tightness, lack of fresh air, and potential posture problems for tall people. However, these disadvantages were insignificant compared to the main task: survival. This seemingly simple architectural detail demonstrates farmers' deep, if intuitive, understanding of the physical principles of heat transfer and their ability to adapt their buildings to harsh environmental conditions. In medieval England, where forests were often cut down or controlled by lords, firewood was not always an easily accessible and cheap fuel for peasants. This forced them to look for alternative sources of energy, and they found them in the most unexpected places, using materials that seem unsuitable to us today, but which were vital for survival in the harsh winter. Peat was one of the main alternative fuels. Peat was ubiquitous in the marshes and lowlands of England. Its extraction was a laborious process. Peat was dug out of the ground with special shovels, dried in the sun and wind for several months, and then used to heat hearths. Torf burns slowly, giving even, though not very strong heat. It emits a lot of smoke and a peculiar smell, but it was available and, most importantly, free or very cheap. The use of peat made it possible to significantly save precious firewood and ensure continuous burning of the hearth. Even more exotic and shocking by modern standards, the fuel was dried animal dung. In regions where there were no forests or peat bogs, manure, especially from cattle, became a salvation. It was collected, mixed with straw or clay, formed into briquettes or tortillas, and then carefully dried in the sun. Dry manure burned slowly, giving stable heat and minimal smoke, especially compared to wet wood. This was extremely important for homes without chimneys. Although the smell of burning was certainly peculiar, it was much less pungent than the smell of raw wood. The use of peat and manure demonstrates the remarkable ingenuity and adaptability of medieval peasants. They were able to use any available resources for survival, turning waste into a vital source of energy. These green technologies of the Middle Ages were not a luxury, but a desperate necessity that allowed them to heat and cook food when there were simply no other options. This practice highlights how connected medieval peasants were to nature and how deeply they understood the cycles and resources of their surroundings. In some areas of England, especially where hilly or windy landscapes predominated, farmers used another unique architectural technique to insulate their homes: roll-in. This meant that part of the house, and sometimes the whole house, was literally dug into the ground or surrounded by earth mounds on one or more sides. This method has been extremely effective in protecting against cold, wind, and moisture by harnessing the natural insulating properties of the soil. Earth is an excellent heat insulator. It has a high heat capacity and slowly heats up and cools down. When a house is encased in earth, this mass of earth acts as a buffer, protecting the walls from sudden changes in temperature. In winter, the earth retains heat inside, preventing it from escaping, and in summer it keeps it cool. This significantly reduced heat loss through the walls, which were one of the main sources of heat loss in poorly insulated houses. In addition, the harness provided protection from the wind. The wind could blow heat through cracks and gaps in the walls, and the earth mounds created a powerful barrier, significantly reducing the wind speed at the surface of the house. This reduced convective heat loss and made the house less drafty. In areas with strong winds, this was vital for maintaining a comfortable temperature. Sometimes the houses were completely or partially built into the hillside or into natural depressions. This not only provided natural insulation, but also greatly simplified construction, since one or more walls of the house were already built by nature itself. Such houses were less visible on the landscape, which could also serve as an additional protection from raids and robbers. Collapsed houses required less building materials for walls, or none at all for collapsed sides, and they were more resistant to bad weather. However, they required a good drainage system to prevent the accumulation of moisture and the penetration of dampness into the home. Despite this method of construction demonstrates farmers' deep understanding of the local landscape and their ability to use natural resources for their own needs, creating homes that were literally merged with the surrounding environment and provided maximum protection from the elements. Even in the simplest peasant houses, where every detail was thought out from the point of view of survival, great attention was paid to protecting the entrance from the cold and wind. The door was one of the main sources of heat loss, as icy air entered the house every time it was open. To combat this, the peasants used various primitive but effective structures, which can be called proto-vestibules, or windproof canopies. First, the doors themselves were as simple and dense as possible, often made of thick wooden planks, and hung so as to fit as tightly as possible to the doorway. Sometimes they were additionally insulated from the inside with layers of straw or hides, but the main defense was the outer barrier. In front of the entrance to the house, small wooden or wicker awnings could be built, which created something like an entrance hall or vestibule. This space served as a buffer zone. When the door was opened, cold air first entered the vestibule and not directly into the living room. This significantly reduced the airflow rate and minimized the amount of cold air entering the interior. Such vestibules could also be used for storing firewood, tools, or drying shoes, which further increased their functionality. Sometimes, instead of stationary awnings, heavy curtains made of animal skins or thick cloth were used, which were hung from the inside in front of the doorway. These curtains could be additionally insulated with straw or dry leaves. They created another layer of air and served as an effective barrier against drafts, especially at night or in strong winds. These curtains could be quickly pushed aside when needed and then pulled back to maximize heat retention. In some cases, the entrance to the house could be designed to be offset from the main axis of the house, creating a kind of zigzag corridor. This caused the cold wind to turn several times before entering the living area, significantly reducing its strength and temperature. Such solutions, although they required additional space and effort during construction, were extremely effective in windy regions. These primitive but ingenious methods of protecting the entrance demonstrate how farmers, without access to sophisticated technologies, intuitively understood the principles of heat preservation and used them to ensure their survival in harsh conditions. When resources were extremely limited, medieval peasants used literally everything they could find to insulate their homes. In addition to clay, straw, and manure for coating, they resorted to using rotten straw, dried leaves, and moss as filler for walls and roofs. This method, although it seems unattractive to us now, was an incredibly effective and affordable way to improve the thermal insulation properties of the house. The walls of peasant houses often consisted of a wicker frame made of brushwood, which was then smeared with clay. The space between the bars of the frame, as well as the cavities inside the walls, could be filled with a dense layer of rotten straw, fallen leaves, dry moss, or even wood shavings. These materials, due to their loose and porous structure, created many air pockets which, as we know, are excellent insulators. The air trapped inside the walls slowed down the transfer of heat from inside to outside, and the penetration of cold from outside to inside. The use of rotten straw and leaves was particularly pragmatic, as these materials were universally available and completely free. They could be gathered in the forest, in the fields, or around the village. Although rotten straw may have been a source of mold or insects, in medieval times when survival was a priority, these disadvantages were considered insignificant. The main thing is to keep it warm. In addition to walls, these materials were actively used for roof insulation. Under the main thatched roof layer, additional layers of dry leaves or moss could be laid, which created additional insulation and prevented the penetration of cold air through leaks in the straw. Sometimes these materials were also used to seal floors, cramming them under wooden decking or directly onto the earthen floor, then covering them with a denser layer of clay or straw. This approach to insulation, based on the use of the simplest and most affordable natural materials, was a real salvation for the peasants. It demonstrates their amazing ingenuity and ability to adapt to the harshest conditions, turning seemingly garbage into a vital resource for survival. In medieval peasant homes, where windows were rare and a source of heat loss, every detail was thought out for maximum efficiency. One of these features was the recessed windows and earthen niches elements that we consider decorative today, but which for the peasants were functional solutions to conserve heat and use of space. Recessed windows, or window niches, were created by building thick walls with small openings for light. The window was not located on the outer surface of the wall, but deeper in the thickness of the wall. This created a sort of box-like structure around the window that served several functions. First, it increased the thickness of the insulation layer around the most vulnerable point, the window opening. The cold air coming in from outside had to pass through this well, losing some of its energy before reaching the interior. This slowed down the arrival of cold and reduced drafts. Secondly, such niches could be used to place small lamps, for example, clay lamps with fat or oil, which made it possible to effectively use their light for illumination without taking up useful space inside the room. Third, in the daytime, if the sun was shining, deep niches could contribute to the accumulation of solar heat. The sun's rays entering the niche heated its walls, and then this heat was gradually transferred to the room. In addition to windows, earthen niches were often made in the walls of houses, similar to how it was done in dugouts. These niches could be used to store dishes, groceries, or even as small sleeping places for children. Their main advantage was that they were completely surrounded by a thick layer of earth, which ensured a stable temperature inside. Food stored in such niches remained fresh longer in winter, since the ground did not allow them to freeze completely, and cool in summer. These recesses and niches demonstrate how farmers, without sophisticated engineering, intuitively use the properties of the earth and the thickness of the walls to create efficient, multifunctional elements of their homes. This was not just building, but a deep understanding of the interaction of man, home, and environment, aimed at maximum survival in harsh conditions. We saw how resourceful and resilient medieval English peasants were to survive the harsh winters, From heat-accumulating beds and dirty ceiling to portable campfires, sleeping with animals, snow fortresses, smoked ceilings, and even proto-heated floors. Each method was a testament to their desperate savvy and unyielding will to live. Their homes were not just shelters, they were complex, if primitive, engineering structures that reflected a deep understanding of the natural world and the principle of making the most of every available resource. These people, seemingly disenfranchised and deprived of all the benefits of civilization, were in fact true masters of survival, whose knowledge and adaptability allowed them to pass through centuries of cold, hunger, and deprivation. Their story is not just a collection of facts, it is an inspiring account of how the human spirit can overcome the most incredible challenges. And if you've watched up to this point, then you also appreciate deep knowledge and amazing stories. Subscribe to our channel right now so that you don't miss even more exciting dives into the past that will make you take a fresh look at our world and the place of man in it. Click on the bell to always keep up to date with our new videos and leave comments. Your opinion is important to us.